In this cafe, we're going to talk about how you become a teacher in the United States. We've talked about different occupations, different jobs in previous cafes and how you get those jobs in the US, what kind of education and training you need. Today we'll talk about teachers. We'll also talk a little bit about what happens when you have a meal in a restaurant in the United States. It's not always the same in different countries what happens during the meal, so we'll talk a little bit about that. As always, we'll answer a few of your questions as well. Let's get started. Our first topic today is how to become a teacher in the United States, specifically how to become a teacher for the elementary or grade school, as well as the high school or secondary level. Teachers in the U.S. must receive a license in most states in order to be able to teach in a public school. There are also teacher licenses for what we would call preschool. These are programs for children who are younger than first grade. Teachers are licensed like many different occupations, many different jobs, by each individual state. There is no U.S. national teaching license. Each state you work in has its own license, and when you move from one state to another, you often have to get an additional license or take some additional training in order to teach in that state. Many states, however, have what's called reciprocal agreements. Reciprocal, reciprocal, means that both people or both states will act the same toward each other, give each other the same rights. So if I have a license in Minnesota and I want to teach in Iowa, a different state, and they have a reciprocal agreement, that means that I can go to Iowa and teach, and I don't need any additional coursework, any additional education to get that Iowa license. In all of the U.S. states, you are required to become a teacher to first get a bachelor's degree. This is the 4-year Bachelor of Arts or Bachelor of Sciences degree. This is the minimum requirement for becoming a teacher in the U.S. Back many years ago, the requirement for becoming a teacher was much lower. You only needed usually 2 years of education, and you would go to a special school, what we used to call a normal school. And this was a place where teachers would get their education in order to become regular classroom teachers. Many of the great public universities in the United States began in the 19th century as teacher colleges, as 2-year colleges. As the country grew and as the need for higher education increased, these colleges were made bigger, they were expanded, and eventually the requirements for becoming a teacher became greater and greater. I said earlier that each state in the United States has its own rules, its own license. This is something that is often surprising to people from other countries. They think that if you live in California, you do the same things you would do if you lived in New York to become, for example, a teacher. but that's not true. In some states, you only need a bachelor's degree with a specialization, what we would call a major or a minor, in education. And so during those 4 years of your bachelor's degree, you take courses in education and you do the other training required. In other states, such as California, you have to get your bachelor's degree first, and then you have to go to 1 or 2 more years of schooling in order to get a teaching license, what we would call a teaching credential, CREDENTIAL. The word credential means qualifications, or a certificate that says that you can do a certain thing, in this case that you can teach. The teaching license in California requires you go an additional 2 years, 1 to 2 years, after you complete your bachelor's degree. We call this a post-baccalaureate program. Post-baccalaureate comes from the word bachelor, as in bachelor's degree. Post is after, so after your bachelor's degree. In some states, you can get a master's degree. A master's degree usually requires 1 to 3 years of additional education. For example, when I got my teaching license back in Minnesota, I had a bachelor's degree in Spanish and in history. I then went to get my teaching license in a post-baccalaureate program, but I also decided to get a master's degree at the same time. So during the 1.5 years that I studied, I got a master's degree and I got a teaching license. Most states don't require a master's degree in order to teach. As I say, each state is different. The training that you have to do in your bachelor's degree or post-baccalaureate program usually requires you take classes about education, about how to teach. That should be obvious. You also are required to do student teaching. This is sometimes called a practicum, Practicum. A practicum is when you are training for a certain position. You have the education, but now you need the actual practical experience. Again, this is something that depends on the state where you are living. In some states, you are required to teach 3 or 4 months with the supervision or under the supervision of what we call a master teacher, an experienced teacher who helps you in your classroom. So you begin to teach these classes, and there is another teacher, an experienced licensed teacher, who helps you. In addition to taking these special courses and doing student teaching, most states require that you take an examination, that you pass an examination in order to get your teaching license. These are examinations that usually test what we call basic skills. This is the ability to read and write, do basic arithmetic and math. There are also exams for the specific topics or subjects that you teach. So if you're a history teacher, you have to take an examination on history. This is especially true for high school or secondary teachers. Finally, because there is such a need for teachers in many schools have difficulties finding good teachers. Many states now have what's called an alternative teacher certification program. These are ways of getting your teaching license that are faster than the traditional way. These are typically for people who have lots of experience already in the world. They already have a bachelor's degree, perhaps a master's degree in the topic that they are going to teach. They still have to pass examinations, but they often start teaching as part of what we would call an internship program. An internship program is where they get paid to teach like a regular teacher, but they have someone who works with them to help them become a better teacher. They still have to take some additional classes, but it doesn't take as long as a traditional teacher credential program. When I got my license many years ago to teach at the high school level, I went through a traditional program. I did one semester, 3 or 4 months of student teaching. Usually in student teaching you are not paid, so you are working for free as you are going through your practicum or your student teaching experience. So if you want to become a teacher in the United States now, you know what you need to do. Our second topic is about eating at a restaurant. Not too long ago, recently, one of our ESL podcast listeners from Italy, Matteo, was visiting here in Los Angeles and emailed me, asked if we could get together for dinner, and we did. One of the things that we talked about was the differences between eating in an Italian restaurant and eating in an American restaurant. So I thought it would be a nice idea to talk a little bit about what happens when you walk into a restaurant in the United States. Typically you walk in, and this may be the same in your country in many cases. You walk in and there is a person who we would call the host or the hostess, if it's a woman, who is going to seat you. He or she is going to take you to your table. They usually ask you how many people are in your party, in your group. You can say just 2 or whatever the number is. Then you'll sit down and the waiter or the waitress, if it's a woman, will come to your table and ask you for your drink order. Do you want a beer? Do you want Coca-Cola? Do you want just water? They'll also tell you in many restaurants about the specials for the day. These are things that are not on the regular menu, the regular list of what the restaurant offers, but are available that day to order. They'll often also tell you what the soup of the day is. Then they'll leave you and give you time to look at the menu and come back with your drinks. The server will usually, and notice I use the word server to mean either waiter or waitress. It means the same. The server will bring you your drinks and ask you if you want to order an appetizer. In a nice restaurant, you usually order the appetizers first, and then later you order your main meal, your main dish, your entree. But in an informal restaurant, they expect you to give them the appetizer and the entree at the same time. If you're not sure, just order both of them at the same time. In a formal restaurant, after your appetizer is served, after it is brought to your table so you can eat it, then the server will ask you for your entree. For an informal restaurant, they will bring you your appetizer, and then perhaps 10 minutes later or so, maybe 20 minutes, they will bring you your entree. Sometimes people want to share a meal. They're not that hungry and they want the meal to be split, to be divided between them. Some restaurants will charge what is called a split charge, meaning you have to pay a couple of extra dollars if you want to share your entree. Look at the menu at the bottom of the menu, and if there is a split charge, it will usually tell you. So then your entree is served, and in a U.S. restaurant, you order usually all of your courses at one time. That is, if you are going to have a soup, and then you're going to have a steak, and you also want to have a salad or something else, you tell the server all this information when you order your entree at the beginning of the meal. In some countries, you order one part of your meal, then you go and you order your next part of your meal, and so forth. But in a U.S. restaurant, usually you order all of the main parts of your meal together. This is especially true in an informal restaurant, what we would call a diner or a cafe, where it's a smaller informal restaurant. In a formal restaurant, the waiter or waitress usually checks back with you, meaning they come back 2, 3, maybe 10 minutes later and ask you if everything is okay. And if there are no problems, you usually just say, everything's fine. After you finish your entree, then you can order your dessert. The dessert, the sweet part of the meal after the entree, is usually ordered after you finish your entree in both a formal and an informal restaurant. This is the one thing that you will not order at the very beginning when you sit down. The waiter or waitress will then bring your dessert or your after-dinner drink if you ordered one. If you don't want a dessert, you can say, no thank you, just the check please. In American restaurants, the server will usually bring you the bill, the check, even when you don't ask for it. When they think that you are done with your meal, they will bring you the check and put it on your table, and usually say something like, whenever you're ready. In some countries, this is not done. In fact, it's considered almost insulting, like they're trying to get you to leave the restaurant as soon as possible. But it's a common custom in U.S. restaurants, and you shouldn't be surprised by it. In most restaurants, except a fast food restaurant like McDonald's, you usually leave a tip. For a lunch meal, it's between 10 and 15% of your bill. For dinner, it's usually between 15 and 20%. This is for both informal and formal restaurants if you have a waiter or a waitress. Many of the waiters and waitresses make most of their money from tips, so it's a common custom to leave a tip in both formal and informal restaurants in the U.S. Now let's answer a few of your questions. Our first question comes from Ronnie, or Rony, R-O-N-Y, in Brazil. The question has to do with the expression to walk the walk and talk the talk. What does it mean when someone says, you have to walk the walk and talk the talk? This means you have to behave or act the way someone in your situation or position is supposed to act. You have to talk the way someone in your position is supposed to talk. It means you have to behave or act according to what you say, doing what you say you are going to do as well. For example, Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger of California, our governor now, got into trouble because he was trying to show how he was helping the environment. But he also drove a very large car that used a lot of gasoline. In this case, it was a Hummer. So he sold his Hummer. He sold the car that was not very environmentally friendly, something that was not good for the environment, and bought a smaller car. This is a case where someone who talked the talk but didn't walk the walk. So he had to change his actions. Joyce, from I'm not sure where, wants to know the difference between the words constraint and restraint. Constraint, constraint, means a limitation or a restriction. Restraint, restraint, is something you do to keep someone under your control. So they are similar meanings. We usually use the word restraint when we are talking about controlling a person, someone who is out of control, someone who needs to be controlled. For example, the police arrested two men who were fighting, and they had to put restraints on each of them so they wouldn't continue fighting. In a car, we have special things that are used especially for young children to prevent them from getting hurt if there's an accident. They keep them in their seat, and these are called restraints. Constraint would be used more, for example, if we were talking about some restriction or limitation in what we could do. For example, one main constraint on how many podcasts we make each week is the amount of time we have each day. Time is a constraint. It limits us. We don't have 100 hours to record our podcasts. That's a constraint. Finally, Arnoldo, Arnoldo, in Costa Rica, wants to know the meaning of the expression, no monkey business. This is an interesting expression. Monkey business, monkey like the animal, a monkey, is to behave silly or perhaps to try to cheat someone. For example, before my parents left home, they told my brothers, no monkey business when we're gone. Here it would mean don't be doing anything that would damage the house, or don't be doing anything stupid, really, is what that means. So monkey business is something that you are doing that is wrong, that is causing a problem. It's an informal expression, however. You wouldn't say that in a business. The other expression Arnoldo wanted to have defined is on a regular basis. On a regular basis just means at a regular or same or similar time. For example, we have our podcasts on a regular basis, on Mondays, on Wednesdays, and on Fridays. We release our podcasts on a regular basis. It's the same amount of time between each podcast each week.